Hello, good afternoon. I have two pieces of housekeeping business to begin, if I may. First request, please sure to turn off the beepers and the rings on your electronic gizmos. And second, a request that there be no photography during this afternoon's event. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Louise Cowan, and as the Warden of Hart House, it's my great honor to welcome you to today's event with esteemed Professor of Linguistics, prolific author, political theorist, and public intellectual, Dr. Noam Chomsky, who will speak to the state-corporate complex, a threat to freedom and survival. Before turning the floor over to Linda McQuaig, who will introduce our guest, I would like to tell you a little bit about Hart House and the Hart House Debates Committee, the student group co-hosting today's event with Science for Peace and the Near East Cultural Educational Foundation, and share with you in particular why we're so pleased to have the opportunity to host Professor Chomsky. The Hart House Vision Statement describes Hart House as a living laboratory of social, artistic, cultural, and recreational experiences where all voices, rhythms, and traditions converge. As the vibrant home for the education of the mind, body, and spirit envisioned by its founders, Hart House encourages and supports activities that provide spaces for awakening the capacity for self-knowledge and self-expression. Hart House has always stood as the proud champion of education that extends beyond the lecture hall, and our vision statement expresses our commitment to offer richly diverse programming to provide students with entry points to find their voice, awaken their curiosity, challenge deeply held ideas, and negotiate emerging identities. Events such as today's lecture contribute to our goal and to the fabric of campus life by providing spaces for critical discourse and dissenting opinions, and for campus and community members to engage in vital conversations, thereby helping us all make meaning of the world around us. The Hart House Debates Committee, made up of students from across the university, focused their activities on creating opportunities for debate and dialogue on the important issues of the day. They are one of a number of student groups at Hart House who give voice to our vision through diverse programming, conceived and executed by students, for students, and the broader community. Over the past few years, the Debates Committee have hosted events on topics such as the limits of free speech, the criminalization of HIV status, gender testing in sports, Canada's role in Afghanistan, dealing with dictators, Sharia law in Ontario, as well as debates among political leaders at the provincial, the local, and the federal levels. Given this rich tradition, the committee is particularly pleased to host Professor Chomsky and, in so doing, provide an opportunity for students and members of the broader community to engage with his powerful critique of the current model of global capitalism. So without further delay, I'm pleased to invite Linda McQuaig to formally introduce Professor Chomsky. Linda McQuaig has earned a national reputation for taking on the establishment. The National Post called McQuaig Canada's Michael Moore. Career highlights include winning a National Newspaper Award for a series of Globe and Mail articles, which sparked a public inquiry into the activities of political lobbyist Patty Starr, eventually leading to Starr's imprisonment, and two Maclean's cover stories probing the questionable business dealings of Conrad Black. McQuaig has also taken on the prevailing orthodoxies in a series of books about politics and economics, including 7 national Canadian bestsellers. Her latest book, The Trouble with Billionaires, written with tax professor Neil Brooks, shows how the rise of an exceptionally wealthy new elite has far-reaching negative consequences for society. Please join me in a warm welcome for Linda McQuaig. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise, for those very kind words, which I appreciate very much. And thank you for that warm welcome. I just want to say how absolutely thrilled and delighted I am to be here introducing someone who for so long has been an icon and legendary hero to me. How does one introduce Noam Chomsky, my God? Just a few kind of highlights or a few kind of descriptions of him. He's been described as arguably the most important intellectual alive today by the New York Times, perhaps the most widely read voice on foreign policy on the planet. You can see these are superlative types of comments. He's been cited more often than any other living scholar. In fact, he's the 8th most cited source of all time, including Plato and Aristotle, Galileo, Descartes. Oh, and here's one that I've been told to throw in. He holds an honorary doctorate from U of T. And just one I would quickly add that he's been a source of inspiration to so many people like myself who aspire in some way to challenge the establishment and challenge the powers that dominate our society. And yet, despite this huge impact he's had, being the 8th most cited person in the history of the world, it's fascinating to note that he kind of remains outside the mainstream. We see a huge crowd here today and many, many more who've been turned away. And yet, interestingly, it isn't really a media circus. We don't really have thousands of media descending on us the way we would if presumably Aristotle or Descartes or somebody like that was here. And that's because, to a certain extent, I think the media treats Chomsky with suspicion and even with hostility. In fact, he was just telling me at lunch that the only American media that puts him on regularly is Fox News. And I think that's probably more out of a kind of curiosity than any serious interest in his views. Professor Chomsky started out, of course, in the field of linguistics. As a young professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, he kind of revolutionized the field of linguistics. He's described often as the father of modern linguistics, and he's received enormous public recognition for the breakthrough work he's done in linguistics and continues to do as a leading thinker in this field, perhaps the leading thinker. But the fascinating thing is when he turned his focus from linguistics, where he was treated as an international superstar, when he turned that focus to political analysis and used that same formidable intellect that led to all those breakthroughs in thinking in linguistics, when he applied that to political analysis, the reception was very different. In fact, the reception was often very hostile. He started doing this in a very prominent way early in the days of the Vietnam War, and he challenged the American role in ways that people simply weren't ready for, or at least the elite was not ready for. And so the hostility that came at him is perhaps not surprising when you think of what Chomsky did. What Chomsky did and what Chomsky continues to do is to challenge and expose power, to expose what it's about, expose it in its full naked truth, and expose its goals and all the myths that surround it. So, for instance, he challenged the notion, the widely held and accepted notion, that what the U.S. was doing in Vietnam or what it's done in so many other countries was in some way kind of benign, and that it was about bringing good or helping other people or making the world safe for terrorists or whatever, that somehow the U.S. in its exercise of power was different than other imperial powers had been in the past. In fact, Chomsky has exposed relentlessly that both the United States and increasingly Canada, as we get on board with American activities abroad, shall we say, is in fact advancing specific interests in the way all imperial powers do, and that those interests are largely corporate interests. Now, in exposing this sort of thing, he also, of course, exposes the role of the intellectual, and this has been some of his most important work, the intellectuals, the academics, the media. He exposes their failure to challenge power, to specifically challenge the power of their own governments. In other words, they can be incredibly insightful and they can be incredibly tough when they go after the enemy. They can see the hypocrisy and the nakedness of the power of, let's say, the Soviets or the bureaucrats in Iran. But they are so often, the intellectual elite here, so often blind when looking at the actions of our own side. Our leading commentators, in fact, tend to be enormously soft on those in power here, and in fact tend to be apologists for power. In fact, Chomsky often compares them. He'll suddenly make the point that, that could have been spoken by somebody at Pravda. And by the way, when you hear that, at first it sort of jars you. But when you actually go through and read his stuff, it's so relentless, it's so meticulous, it's so careful. You come away realizing he's absolutely right. And when you do that, of course, you'll never feel the same about Peter Mansbridge again. And in doing this, of course, Chomsky's focusing on the abdication of responsibility on the part of intellectuals that on our side. When they see atrocities committed by our side in wars abroad, they talk about, well, things may have gone wrong, that shouldn't have happened, there was a little collateral damage. But in fact, what Chomsky so clearly shows is that this is part of systematic, ruthless exercise of power, advancing very specific interests of corporate power, and that it's done with an absolute, reckless, callous regard or indifference for people around the world. And in this way, by doing this, our intellectuals, in failing to pick up on what our elite is doing, is in a sense providing a sort of cover for them. I was reminded of this a couple of years ago. Remember when, after the war in Iraq, and it was finally acknowledged clearly that the war in Iraq had not been about weapons of mass destruction. I think Dick Cheney eventually even acknowledged it. Now that's a kind of crucial revelation, right? And I remember watching Wolf Blitzer on CNN, and he was kind of scratching his head and said, "My goodness, how could we have all got it so wrong?" And I was thinking, we? I remember before the invasion of Iraq, I remember 10 million people out in the streets all over the world protesting that invasion. They somehow didn't get it wrong. In fact, I remember them carrying signs, how did our oil get under their sand? And I mean, they understood that the invasion probably wouldn't have happened if Iraq was, instead of sitting on a ton of oil, was sitting on, let's say, a ton of carrots or something. But somehow Wolf Blitzer and the people in the media didn't get that. They didn't get it because they didn't have the same skepticism that ordinary people have, and they didn't ask the tough questions, even though they were very much in a position to ask those tough questions. And so as a result, they let those in power slither away. Well, Chomsky never lets those in power slither away. And in that sense, he is the true public intellectual. Now, of course, all this is particularly important, takes on particular meaning, the role of the intellectual when we're talking about the university. Because here at the university, we think of this as a place of critical inquiry. If anywhere is going to challenge the prevailing norms and the prevailing ideas, it's going to be here at the university. And actually, if you read the U of T statement of purpose, you see some incredibly strong statements about how, and this is on the U of T Governing Council's website, we affirm that the university's unique concept, the most crucial of all human rights, are the rights of freedom of speech, academic freedom, freedom of research. We affirm that these rights are meaningless unless they entail the right to raise deeply disturbing questions and provocative challenge to the cherished beliefs of society at large and the university itself. It is this human right to radical critical teaching and research with which the university has a duty above all to be concerned, because there is no one else, no other institution, no other office in our modern liberal democracy which is the custodian of this most precious and vulnerable right of the liberated human spirit. Wow. I mean, that's powerful. It almost brings tears to your eyes. A powerful statement of the university as an important body to keep accountable those in power and to keep a critical eye on what's going on. In fact, in reality, the university often, I must say, fails to live up to this. Of course, many of you are familiar with the situation of the Munk School of Global Affairs, the $35 million donation given by Peter Munk, the CEO of Barrick Gold, to set up a School of Global Affairs. And this, of course, raises the question, will that school encourage the kind of investigation of, let's say, mining companies operating in the third world that a School of Global Affairs logically should? I can say from looking at the Munk agreement with U of T that there's reason to worry about this, that in fact Munk has more influence than one would want. That the biggest part of his, or a big part of his donation, $15 million, is only to be given down the road and only after he's satisfied with the direction of the school. He also it's also specified in the agreement that the Munk School will be in this beautiful heritage building, and only the senior professors and their guests will be allowed to enter by the front door. That everybody else, the junior faculty, the public, the students, will enter by the back door. Anyway, you may know there's a protest this afternoon. In fact, right after this event, there's a protest going before the Governing Council out in front of the Governing Council to urge them to reconsider this whole Munk situation. And Professor Chomsky has indicated that he plans to attend. In fact, he's invited me to go along with him. And, if any one of you wanted to come along too, we could make it a party. And I just want to point out that we will be entering by the front door. Now, I dropped off Professor Chomsky last night at his hotel after his speech out at U of T Scarborough, and I was struck by the fact that I pulled up and a taxi driver started honking at me, and I thought, oh boy, parked in the wrong place or something. And the guy was really insistent, and it turned out it was just he was so excited. There was Noam Chomsky, who he'd seen back in his native Greece years ago and always, remained a huge fan of. And this just kind of reminded me why Chomsky is, in fact, the most important intellectual alive today, that, he exposes those in power and the way they exercise and abuse power and the elites that cooperate and cover up for them. And he does all this in the public interest, in the interest of the common person. And I, more than any individual today, I think it can be truly said that Noam Chomsky speaks truth to power. I give you Noam Chomsky. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Well, I'm going to talk mostly about the United States, in part because I know it better, but also in part because of its unique significance in the global system. That's been true dramatically since the Second World War. The character and extent of this uniqueness often isn't understood and would be easily worth a talk in itself, but I won't go into that. However, we constantly see that even in relatively small ways. So, for example, when a housing bubble in the United States burst a couple of years ago, that initiated a global economic crisis, which most of the world is still mired in. The worst outcomes were just averted by quite desperate measures. In another domain, when France and Britain wanted to bomb Libya a couple of weeks ago, they had to turn to a more reluctant Washington to do the heavy lifting and provide the vast bulk of the means of violence. The U.S. has a huge comparative advantage in that domain. Furthermore, although the United States, U.S. society and its political economy are unusual in some respects, it's not that different from elsewhere. And in fact, developments within the United States over the years have often foreshadowed what is going to happen pretty soon in other industrial societies of the state capitalist world. That world, in fact the whole world, is of course always changing, but there are significant continuities and they're worth bearing in mind. One continuity is that those who control the economic life of a country also tend to have overwhelming influence over state policy. And that should be a truism taught in elementary school. It was formed succinctly by Adam Smith in words that I've quoted before, but are important enough to repeat. He, speaking of Britain, of course, he wrote that the principal architects of policy are the owners of the society. In his day, the merchants and manufacturers, the masters of mankind, as he called them, and they ensure that state policy serves their interest, however grievous the effect on others, including the domestic population, but primarily the victims of what he called their savage injustice abroad. And India was his prime example. That was early in the days of the destruction of India. Today the masters of mankind are multinational corporations and financial institutions, but the lesson still applies, and it helps explain why the state corporate complex is indeed a threat to freedom and, in fact, even survival. Well, by now, version that I know is by political economist Thomas Ferguson, what he calls his investment theory of politics, which in brief and simplified essentially views U.S. elections as occasions in which coalitions of private investors coalesce to invest to control the state. It turns out to be a thesis of quite high predictive success over more than a century, as he shows. What it means, in effect, is that elections are pretty much bought and that the buyers expect to be rewarded. And that happens all the time. It was illustrated very clearly in the last U.S. presidential election in 2008. President Obama's victory traces largely to a huge influx of capital from the financial institutions, especially toward the end of the campaign. They preferred him to his opponent, McCain, and they expected to be rewarded. And of course they were. The country at that time was mired in a deep recession, so Obama's first act was to select an economic team. It was drawn almost entirely from those who had caused the severe economic crisis that he inherited. He systematically avoided critics of their practices, including quite prestigious ones, Nobel laureates. Actually, the business press wrote rather ironically about this. Bloomberg News did a review of Obama's economic team, went through each one of them, looked at their records, and concluded that these people shouldn't be on the economic team to fix up the economy. They should be getting subpoenas, which was pretty correct. They didn't, of course. Well, not surprisingly, the team chose measures which rewarded the major culprits, who are now richer and more powerful than before, and poised to lead the way to the next and probably more severe financial crisis. Now, there was recently an interesting article about this by the special inspector of the bailout programs, Neil Borofsky. He wrote a bitter condemnation of the way it was executed. He points out that the legislative act that authorized the bailout was a bargain. The financial institutions that were responsible for the crisis would be saved by the taxpayer, and the victims of their misdeeds, in fact real crimes, the victims would be somewhat compensated by measures to protect home values and preserve home ownership. It was mostly a housing crisis. Well, only the first part of the bargain was kept. The financial institutions were rewarded lavishly for causing the crisis, and they were forgiven for outright crimes, but the rest of the program floundered. As Borofsky points out, I'm quoting him, foreclosures continue to mount, with 8 to 13 million filings forecast over the program's lifetime, while the biggest banks are 20% larger than they were before the crisis and control a larger part of the economy than ever. They reasonably assume that the government will rescue them again if necessary. Indeed, credit rating agencies incorporate future government market bailouts into their assessments of the largest bank. That means exaggerating market distortions that provide them with an unfair advantage over smaller institutions which continue to struggle. So in short, as he puts it, Obama's programs were a giveaway to Wall Street executives and a blow in the solar plexus to their defenseless victims. In other words, the government listened to those who have a voice in the political system and acted accordingly, all completely in accord with Smith's truism. Well, there should be no surprises here. There are careful studies of Senate votes over a long period, and they show that the Senate is indeed responsive to a sector of the population, the top third in income. Actually, a closer analysis would show that it's a very small fraction of that top third. In contrast, there's no correlation at all between Senate votes and opinions of the middle third. For the bottom third, there is a correlation. It's negative. Senate votes are counter to preferences for the bottom third. And on major issues of foreign and domestic policy, there's quite a sharp disconnect between public opinion and public policy over a long period. Well, one might argue that these results don't really depart very far from the intentions of the founders of the society. So James Madison, who was the main framer of the constitutional order, he explained to the Constitutional Convention that power should remain in the hands of the Senate. The Senate was not chosen directly by voters until about a century ago. in those days, the executive was pretty much an administrator, not an emperor. And the House, third part of the system, which is closer to the public, had much more limited authority. And that's the way, in fact, it was set up. As Madison explained to the Constitutional Convention, the Senate represents the wealth of the nation, the more capable set of men, men who have respect for property owners and their rights, and understand that government must protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. That's quite accurate, something else that ought to be taught in elementary school. We should bear in mind, however, in Madison's defense, that his mentality was pre-capitalist. So he assumed that a senator would be, as he put it, an enlightened statesman and benevolent philosopher. The Senate would be a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. They would therefore refine and enlarge the public views, guarding the public against the mischiefs of democratic majorities. This is all rather like the noble Roman gentleman of the fantasies of the day. Actually, Adam Smith before him had a sharper eye. Well, it didn't take long for Madison to shift his thinking about this. As he viewed the early results of the democratic experiment, he had second thoughts. In fact, by 1792, just a couple of years later, by then he deplored what he called the daring depravity of the times, as the stock jobbers become the Praetorian band of the government, at once its tool and its tyrant, bribed by its largesses and overawing it by clamors and combinations, which isn't a bad description of today's political system and its social and economic correlates. Well, today, in the richest country in human history, 20% of the population qualify for food stamps. The real unemployment today is at the level of the Great Depression for much of the population, manufacturing workers, for example. And in fact, their actual circumstances are much worse than in the Great Depression, which I'm old enough to remember. Most of my family were unemployed working class, and the country was, of course, far poorer than it is today. But it was a hopeful period in many ways. There was a sense that people were doing something about it, and that times would get better. And indeed, they did, thanks to very active organizing, CIO, other things, and then an immense government stimulus, first during the war, then continuing through the post-war decades. Well, that's not true today. The jobs that are being lost are unlikely to return, at least under the current programs of the masters of mankind. Not graven in stone, but that's their programs. Well, while the population suffers, Goldman Sachs, which is one of the main architects of the current crisis, they're now richer than ever, and they have just quietly announced $17.5 billion in extra compensation for last year, with the CEO, Lloyd Blankfein, getting $12.6 million, while his base salary more than triples. And exactly as Borofsky said, they're poised to play the same game again. Why not? They can rely on the government insurance policy that enables them to safely engage in risky transactions, make huge profits, and they don't take into account what in the jargon of economics are called externalities, the effect of a transaction on others, crucially in their case what's called systemic risk, that is the likelihood that the whole system will collapse as a result of their risky and hence profitable transactions. And when it does collapse, as is anticipated, it's not a big problem. They can run to the powerful nanny state that they nurtured, clutching in their hands their copies of Hayek and Milton Friedman and Ayn Rand and so on, and they can demand the bailout to which they're entitled because they are too big to fail, as it's put. And as one commentator added, Riley also too big to jail for quite serious crimes. It's a pretty impressive scam. Of course, it's in radical violation of capitalist principles, but the masters of mankind believe in those principles only for others, not for themselves. And that stance has a long pedigree. That's another matter that's important to understand if we want to grasp the nature of the world in which we live. Actually, it lies in the background of a very revealing interaction that's taking place right now between two countries that are quite different in terms of independence and economic development, the United States and Egypt. The democracy uprisings in the Arab world, particularly in Egypt, these are events of truly historic importance, and they're very frightening to Western power for very simple reasons. The West is certainly going to do whatever it can to prevent authentic democracy in the Arab world. To see why, it's enough to take a look at the studies of Arab public opinion, which are certainly known to planners, even though not to the Western public, at least to those who keep to the media. What they show is that, for example, in Egypt, about 90% of the population think that the United States is the main threat that they face. Maybe 10% think Iran that is a threat. Actually, about 80% think the region would be more secure if Iran had nuclear weapons. And those figures happen to be high in Egypt, but they're pretty much true across the Arab world. So it's obvious that the West is going to do whatever it can to prevent those opinions from entering into policy, which means to prevent any form of authentic democracy. These are extremely important events, and it's important to take a look at how they're developing. So the first, all of these have long histories, incidentally. So, for example, the Egyptian movement, you probably saw, was led by a group of young, tech-savvy people who called themselves the April 6th movement. Why April 6th? Well, that's a reference to a major labor action that was planned on April 6th, 2008 at one of the major industrial installations in Egypt, the Mahala textile installation. There was supposed to be a big strike, a lot of support activities. I was crushed by the military dictatorship that we were supporting. Forgotten here, who cares, but not forgotten there. And the same is true in the other countries. The things that have been, that have suddenly burst forth are not coming from nowhere. That's true of the first one, too, which doesn't even get reported. The current wave of uprisings actually began in the last African colony, one of the two countries of the Arab world that was invaded, occupied, and settled by an outside power. That's Western Sahara, technically a UN dependency, supposed to move on to decolonization. It was invaded in 1975 by Morocco. Brutal invasion, like most, settled a lot of the Moroccan population there, illegally, of course. And there have been repeated protests. There was another one in November, last November, an effort to set up a tent city. Moroccan forces quickly crushed it. Since it's a UN responsibility, the issue did come to the Security Council, but France made sure that there would be no inquiry into what happened. It has to protect its Moroccan client. That was the first. The other occupied country, as you know, nothing. So far the lid has been on tightly. That's Palestine. Plenty to say about that, but I think most of you are familiar with it, or should be at least, not least from the very courageous and important work done right here by the late Jim Graff. Well, whatever is going to happen, it's not clear. All of this is still work in progress. But despite the internal barriers and external constraints, these popular movements have achieved substantial success, and they have pretty exciting prospects. One of the most dramatic recent moments was last February 20th, when Kamal Abbas sent a message from Tahrir Square in Cairo to Wisconsin workers, saying, "We stand with you as you stood with us." Abbas is a leader of the years of struggle of Egyptian workers for elementary rights that lie in the background of today's Arab Spring. As I said, brutally crushed by the Western-backed dictator. He's also a leading figure in the current uprising. And Abbas's message of solidarity to Wisconsin workers evoked the traditional aspirations of the labor movement, solidarity among working people of the world and populations generally. Well, right now the trajectories in Cairo and Madison are intersecting, but they're headed in opposite directions. In Cairo, towards gaining elementary rights denied by the dictatorships. In Madison, towards defending rights that have been won in long and hard struggles and are now under severe attack. And each of these is a kind of a microcosm of tendencies that are underway in global society following varied courses. And there are sure to be far-reaching consequences of what's taking place in the decaying industrial heartland of the richest and most powerful country in human history, and in what President Eisenhower called the most strategically important area in the world, namely the Middle East, a stupendous source of strategic power, probably the richest economic prize in the world in the field of foreign investment. Those are the words of the State Department in the 1940s. That was a prize that the U.S. intended to keep for itself and its allies in the unfolding New World Order of the day that they were organizing and implementing, and in fact still do. Well, it's normal for the victors to consign history to the trash can, and it's normal for the victims to take it seriously. And if we want to understand the world, we should follow their example. Today is, in fact, not the first occasion when Egypt and the United States are facing similar problems and moving in opposite directions. That was also true in the early part of the 19th century in ways which are quite crucial for both societies and generalize across the world. They're crucial for understanding of the creation of the divide between the rich first world and the poor third world, much less sharp back in those days. Well, at that time, early 19th century, Egypt and the United States were both well placed to undertake rapid economic development. Both of them had rich agriculture. That included cotton, which is sort of the fuel of the early industrial revolution. Although unlike Egypt, the United States had to develop cotton production and a workforce by conquest, extermination, and slavery, with consequences that reverberate to the present. There was one fundamental difference between Egypt and the United States, namely the United States had gained independence, and it was therefore free to ignore the prescriptions of economic theory, which were pretty much the same ones as today. At the time, they were delivered by the greatest economist of the day, Adam Smith, in terms similar to those preached to what are called developing societies today. So Smith urged the American colonies to keep to what was later called their comparative advantage, that is, to produce primary products for export and to import superior British manufactures, and certainly not to try to monopolize crucial goods. That meant particularly cotton in those days, kind of like oil today. Any other path, he warned, I'll quote him, would retard instead of accelerating the further increase in the value of their annual produce, and would obstruct instead of promoting the progress of their country toward real wealth and greatness. Approximately what you study in economic courses today and the advice given to the world by the IMF and the World Bank. Well, having gained their independence, the colonies, U.S. colonies, were free to ignore the laws of sound economics. They were free to follow England's own course of independent, state-guided development with high tariffs to protect industry from superior British exports, first textiles, later steel and others, and a wide variety of other modes of state intervention in order to accelerate economic development. And the independent republic also tried and came pretty close to try to get a monopoly of cotton for a good reason. The purpose was to place all other nations at our feet, as the Jacksonian presidents put it at the time when they were annexing Texas and half of Mexico. They were particularly concerned with England. England was the big enemy in those days. It was a deterrent. And they figured if they monopolized cotton, they could bring England to its feet. That's pretty important. For example, it's one of the reasons why Canada wasn't conquered. British deterred it several times. Maybe it's being conquered in other ways, but that's another matter. But it wasn't militarily conquered. They also couldn't conquer Cuba much as they wanted to because the British fleet was in the way. They did finally conquer it later in the century, 1898, under the pretext of liberating it, but actually conquering it. But the idea was if they could monopolize control of cotton, they could overcome this deterrent that was in the way of expansion. Actually, it's kind of interesting that that's essentially the policy that was attributed to Saddam Hussein in 1990. Ridiculous at that time. But if you look back at the propaganda at the time of the invasion, the pretext was, well, he's trying to monopolize oil and, to bring us all to his feet. I mean, it's totally outlandish. But what was charged, the crime attributed to Saddam Hussein, is in fact one of the main ones that led to U.S. economic development. It happened, and it's had a big effect. One of the reasons it's out of history, except that it's in history. Well, that was the United States. What about Egypt? Egypt couldn't follow a comparable course because it was barred by British power. It wasn't independent. So British Lord Palmerston declared, on his words, that no ideas of fairness toward Egypt ought to stand in the way of such great and paramount interests of Britain as preserving its economic and political hegemony. And he expressed what he called his hate for the ignorant barbarian, Muhammad Ali, the developmentalist leader who was trying to direct Egypt on an independent course. And Britain's fleet and financial resources were deployed to terminate Egypt's quest for independence and economic development. After World War II, the United States displaced Britain as a global hegemon, and it adopted the same position. The U.S. made it clear that Washington would provide no aid to Egypt, and the whole world badly needed aid at the time. The U.S. would provide no aid to Egypt unless it adhered to the standard rules for the weak, ones I cited, which of course the U.S. continued to violate. itself imposing high tariffs to bar Egyptian cotton and causing a debilitating dollar shortage. Actually, that's the usual interpretation of market principles. It's fine for you, fine for disciplining the weak and controlling them, but not me, please. I want the nanny state to make sure I'm okay. That applies at home too, the way Goldman Sachs and its colleagues and their representatives in government understand very well. These are really leading themes of modern history. They're the basis for essentially the basis for the first third world distinction. This generalizes all over, and for what's happening internal to the rich societies as well. Well, as these kind of quite simple principles predict, elections are increasingly just becoming a charade run by the public relations industry, which tries to mobilize populations to vote while making sure that issues are marginalized for the reason I mentioned. The public has different opinions about issues than the masters of mankind, so you want to keep them aside. I should say that while I'm talking about the United States, it's not true everywhere. So if you go, say, to the poorest country in South America, Bolivia, they actually have democratic elections, pretty remarkable ones, and especially in the last 10 years. So in the last 10 years, the most repressed, bitterly repressed segment of the population, the indigenous population, have actually entered the political arena, pressed their demands, took part in elections, won the elections, elected someone from their own ranks, a poor peasant, not somebody from the Skull and Bones at Yale, and won the election on real issues, serious issues like control over resources, cultural rights, how to handle problems of justice in a complex multi-ethnic society. And then in another election a couple of years later, they did even better. Well, that's democracy. You have to look pretty hard to find anything like that in the industrial world. What's happening in our societies is something quite different. The public relations industry, which essentially runs the elections, it's applying certain principles, namely the same principles. It's applying certain principles to undermine democracy, which are the same as the principles it applies to undermine markets. The last thing that business wants is markets in the sense of economic theory. Take a course in economics, they tell you a market is based on informed consumers making rational choices. Anyone who's ever looked at a TV ad knows that's not true. In fact, the industry, if we had a market system, an ad, say, for General Motors, would be a brief statement of the characteristics of the products for next year. That's not what you see. You see some, movie actress or a football hero or somebody, driving a car or, up a mountain or something like that. But the point is to create, and that's true of all advertising. The goal is to undermine markets by creating uninformed consumers who will make irrational choices, and the business world spends huge efforts on that. And the same is true when the same industry, the PR industry, turns to undermining democracy. It wants to construct elections in which uninformed voters will make irrational choices. It's pretty reasonable, and it's so evident you can hardly miss it. And it's another one of those things that ought to be taught in elementary school. It's kind of embarrassing to talk about something so obvious to a university audience. Well, all of this is second nature to the masters of mankind. So, for example, after his 2008 victory, as perhaps you know, Obama immediately won an award from the advertising industry for the best marketing campaign of 2008. He beat out Apple computers. And if you look at the business press, where people talk more openly, executives were euphoric. They said they'd been marketing candidates like toothpaste ever since Reagan, but 2008 was the greatest achievement. They said it was so great it's going to change the style in corporate boardrooms. The 2012 election is now expected to cost $2 billion. It's going to have to be mostly corporate funding. So it's not at all surprising that Obama is selecting business leaders for top positions. The public is quite angry and frustrated, but unless the Western populations can, say, rise to the level of Egyptians, they're going to remain victims. In the United States, the Republicans long ago ceased any pretense of being a traditional political party. They are so deep in the pockets of corporate America and the super rich, you need a telescope to find them. Democrats, who incidentally by now are mostly what used to be called moderate Republicans, so the Democrats there are not too far behind. Obama's choice of an economic team, which I mentioned, is an example. Actually, I didn't put it quite accurately. There was one exception in his economic team, namely Paul Volcker. He was the Secretary of Treasury under Ronald Reagan. But the spectrum has shifted so far to the right that Volcker was the last liberal calling for some kind of regulation. It was, incidentally, not is. He was kicked out, replaced by Jeffrey Immelt. He's the CEO of General Electric. That's the nation's largest corporation. And his special responsibility, if you look back at the rhetoric, was to create jobs. Actually, a more accurate comment, again by Tom Ferguson, is that what we actually have here is the disappearance from the scene of the best known and most visible critic of the excesses of the financial sector, and his replacement by the sitting CEO of a company that is heavily dependent on government aid of all sorts, including diplomatic assistance to invest more in China and to shift jobs there. This is not about jobs, it's about political money. The White House knows it will need to raise about $1 billion for its re-election campaign. That's the context in which this and Obama's other recent appointments need to be judged. And the business world, not surprisingly, was quite pleased. The London Financial Times reported that Mr. Immelt's appointment was applauded by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, major business lobby, which they said has been among the president's harshest critics and funded many Republicans who ran against Democrats in last November's election. But maybe that'll be over, and the last barrier to business rule could be out of the way. Well, if you look at GE, General Electric, more than half of its workforce is abroad. More than half of its revenue comes from overseas operations. Also, most of its revenues come not from production, though it's regarded as a manufacturing enterprise, but from financial operations, for which, incidentally, it received a hefty bailout when Wall Street tanked. While the appointment was proclaimed to be for job growth, it actually has little to do with that. More accurately, it's what's called follow the money. More than a century ago, the great political financier, Mark Hanna, said that two things are important in politics, money, and I've forgotten the second one, another thing for elementary school. That's far more true today, especially with the radical changes of the past 30 years. And they're important to understand. Now, these developments, roughly the last 30-odd years, they followed one of the major changes in world order in the modern period, namely the dismantling of the post-Second World War economic system, so-called Bretton Woods system, which had been designed by the victors of the Second World War, the United States and Britain. Basic designers were John Maynard Keynes for Britain, and the New Deal economist Harry Dexter White for the United States. One central component of this system was regulation of currencies. In fact, that was part of the basis for the huge economic growth of the next couple of decades, the highest in history. Well, that was dismantled about 40 years ago. That was one factor that led to the huge explosion of financial speculation and the vast growth of financial institutions. At that time, they were small components of the economy, and they were mostly doing what banks are supposed to do in state capitalist systems, namely to direct unused funds, like, say, your bank account, to some kind of productive investment. That was then. By 2007, just before the great crash, they gained about 40% of corporate profits in the U.S. Their profits come mostly from complex financial manipulations, actions that have little or if any social or economic utility, and are harmful to the economy and also to people in many ways. These practices would be sharply curtailed if capitalist principles were to prevail. They'd be curtailed by crashes and losing your money. But thankfully, there's no fear of that, at least for the rich. Another factor in the financialization of the economy was that the rate of profit in production was declining. So it was easier to make money by financial manipulations, of course, always with the protection of the nanny state. Closely related development was the offshoring of production. That's within a global trade system that is very carefully designed to set working people in competition with one another worldwide, along with a very high level of protection for wealth and unprecedented rights for investors. That's the usual interpretation of market discipline again. Fine for you, but not for me, please. These developments set in motion a vicious cycle of concentration of wealth, and with it, concentration of political power, again, in accordance with Smith's maxim. For the past 30 years, state corporate policy has been very precisely designed to accelerate this cycle. So inequality, as you probably know, has soared to the highest levels in U.S. history, but less known is that this is actually misleading. The radical inequality results primarily from the extraordinary wealth of the top 1% of the population, actually more accurately, the top 1/10 of 1%. It's a group so small that it's missed by the U.S. Census, which vastly underestimates inequality for this reason. It's been studied by economists. Meanwhile, for the majority of the population, real incomes have pretty much stagnated. People are getting by with heavier workloads, much more, say, than in Europe or even Japan, debt, and asset inflation, like the last housing bubble. The minuscule category of victors, and it is extremely small, that's primarily CEOs, hedge fund managers, and the like, and they use their political power to enhance the process. So tax cuts, for example, are carefully crafted to benefit the super rich. If you look back until around 1980, until Reagan, taxes were in the United States were somewhat redistributive. It's according to the analysis of the Internal Revenue Service, as in most countries. That's what they're supposed to be. Since then, with a couple of blips, that effect has declined, and if other factors are introduced, like, say, tax havens and other evasion options, they redistribute upwards. That's carefully designed. So take, say, the Bush tax cuts 10 years ago, which are a huge burden on the economy. they were designed very carefully. They started in the first year with a tax rebate to people, small rebate. So you get a couple $100 in the mail. You think, this is great, tax rebate. But they were designed so that over the years, the benefits would shift towards the rich. And by the 10th year, when they were due to expire, more than more than half of the tax benefits went to the top 1%, people who count. But then it's kind of invisible if it happens that way. There's a name for it. It's called the sunset technique. You make sure that by the time the sun sets, things are happening the right way. You kind of delude people at the beginning. And only those who are inside the game can see what's planning down the road. These are perfectly normal kind of policies for the people who are called conservatives, who now want to make it permanent. Take a look at the front pages of the newspapers. They want to make these cuts permanent, but for jobs, the same as here. The reason we have to give a huge amount of money to the top 1% of the population, or a fraction of that, which spends it on whatever they feel like, is for jobs. Actually, there's an interesting change that's taken place in the English language in this respect. There is a word which has become obscene, so since there may be children in the audience, I can't say it, but I'll spell it. Profits. You're not allowed to say that. In fact, it has a pronunciation. It's called jobs. And that's kind of by now like routine. And that's what this is about. The same here. Well, all of this is, in fact, these kinds of things, that was the Bush tax cuts, but the same thing's happening right at this moment. Like the lame duck session of Congress, that means, the session after the November election, before the next Congress takes office. Obama was greatly praised for his achievements during the lame duck session, statesman-like display of bipartisanship and so on, praised by his own supporters, in fact. Well, there were some achievements. The main achievement was a tax break for the super rich. And I mean super rich, like I'm pretty well off, but I'm below the cutoff for that one. It was super rich tax cut. Of course, that increased the deficit, which is supposed to be the big thing we're worried about. Carrying that off required some pretty impressive footwork, but it was done. Also, at the same time, there was a tax increase for federal workers, but it wasn't called that because you're not supposed to talk about tax increases. It was called a freeze. Think for 5 minutes, a freeze for maybe 5 seconds. A freeze for public sector workers is identical to a tax increase for them. So this is a tax increase for public sector workers disguised as a freeze. There was also a payroll tax decrease for Social Security. The Social Security is paid by working people, doesn't contribute anything to the deficit, contrary to what you read. Workers pay for it. And there was a decrease in that payment, which kind of sounds good. People need the money. But again, it was a Trojan horse. Take a look at the way it was designed. It was the sunset technique again. The freeze was carefully designed so that it ends right before the presidential election. Now, political figures understand perfectly well that with an election coming up, nobody's going to say, let's raise the payroll tax. So that essentially makes it permanent, which is a way to defund Social Security. Social Security is actually in pretty good shape, despite what everybody screams about. But if you can defund it, it won't be in good shape. And there is a standard technique of privatization, namely defund what you want to privatize. Like when Thatcher wanted to privatize the railroads, first thing to do is defund them. Then they don't work, and people get angry, and they want to change. And you say, okay, privatize them, and then they get worse. And in that case, the government had to step in and rescue it. But that's the standard technique of privatization. Defund, make sure things don't work. People get angry, hand it over to private capital. Well, that's the Social Security scam. If they can succeed in defunding it, been trying for decades, it's too popular to do much about, and very efficient, incidentally, minuscule administrative costs, nothing like the outlandish privatized healthcare system. So it's kind of hard to get rid of, but if you can defund it, it might work out. That's the point of this decision in the lame duck session. And that's kind of important. Social Security, first of all, if it can be privatized, it's a huge bonanza for investors. There's a ton of money in the Social Security system. It's kept in a trust fund or invested in government bonds and goes back to working people. But if that can get into the hands of financial institutions, they can make a ton of money by using those funds to enrich themselves, and as usual, when the system crashes, to going back to the taxpayer to bail them out. So it's a great technique. Also, Social Security really has defects. Like it's of no use whatsoever to wealthy people. I mean, they may get it, but they're not going to notice it. It's a toothpick on a mountain, so who cares? But for a large part of the population, it's their means of survival. That's particularly true right now. People had a tremendous amount of their fake wealth, which they believed in housing. It was all a fake bubble, but they believed in it. It's what was used for borrowing, for education, for anything. That's gone. $8 trillion of it are gone. Those people are going to be surviving on Social Security, but that's of no significance to the wealthy, of course. There's a kind of a deeper point. Social Security is based on the principle that Kamal Abbas was talking about, namely solidarity, social solidarity. Social Security is based on the idea that you're supposed to care what happens to people who are in need. So like if there's a disabled widow across town and she doesn't have food to eat, you're supposed to care about it. That's what Social Security is. And that's a bad idea. You're supposed to look after yourself, not care about other people. The Social Security is dangerous. It kind of undermines preferred doctrines, and it can even lead to action, which could change the way the world works. So we don't want that. In fact, there's a large-scale attack on public education. It's based on the same principles. You can privatize, and the same techniques are being used. Defund it so it doesn't work, complain about how it doesn't work, privatize it, gets worse, but then you've undermined social solidarity, and it's fine for the wealthy anyway. They'll get what they want. Well, all of this is part of a quite impressive campaign of class war, which has many aspects. A lot of them aren't immediately visible, but they're there. So, for example, the government sets rules on how corporations are run, what's called corporate governance. And the rules that have been set up during this passionate class war period, the rules are that CEOs can pick the boards that set their salaries, and they can, and that work out techniques like, say, stock options, which conceal short-term gain. And you can imagine how that works when you pick your own board. Well, there have been efforts to try to get this to be more transparent, but they were beaten back by Congress. Same is true of deregulation. During the period when New Deal regulations were maintained, there were no financial crises. System went along smoothly. Since Reagan, there have been regular financial crises, each one worse than the preceding one, but the rich and powerful make out fine for the reasons I mentioned. Public pays, and rich benefit. Well, all of this is a kind of a new stage of state capitalism. Loyalty to firms is less and less necessary when the goal of management is short-term profits, which of course comes mostly from financial manipulations. So who cares about the firm? If it goes under, fine, I'm rich. Domestic unemployment is not a problem. So there's no need for a domestic workforce when Mexico and China and Vietnam and other sources of cheap and brutally exploited labor can be used as assembly plants, and they are assembly plants, China as well. Major industries increasingly have their workforces overseas, like General Electric, while I have to say that word, I'm afraid, sorry, while profits come home back to the pockets of a few. So take IBM, it's quite an interesting example. The business press recently ran a big article about them and said that correctly that IBM may strike many people as the quintessential American company, but over 70% of its workforce was outside the United States at the end of 2008. And the following year, while continuing to reduce its U.S. employment, the company announced a program to offer employees the opportunity to move their jobs to emerging markets. In other words, you have the opportunity to move to India, say, where you can live at a much lower standard of living. Nice opportunity, but that increases what's called the efficiency of the company, and it provides wealth for the masters. Now, if employees don't take this opportunity that is so benignly offered to them, they have options. They can join the people standing in line for food stamps. But IBM's a benevolent company, the article points out. They're offering to foot some of the relocation costs, so they're really nice guys. The report in the business press didn't explain why IBM should be regarded as the quintessential American company, but there are in fact good reasons. One is that IBM relied on the taxpayer for its wealth. That's how it learned to forget about earlier things like helping out Nazi Germany. But just in the recent period, it learned to shift from punch cards to computers, modern computers. It learned it at Pentagon-funded labs, like MIT, where I work, for example. When finally, in the early 60s, the firm was able to produce its own fast computers, but they were too expensive for businesses, so then any state stepped in to purchase them. Now, in general, a procurement by the state is a major device of taxpayer subsidy. Well, many years later, actually decades later, IBM was finally able to make profits in the market and was also able to spin off wildly successful enterprises like Microsoft and others, which also benefited amply from public subsidy. So indeed, it's true, it is the quintessential American company, and management is following sound economic principles in shifting employment abroad. What happens to the country is not their business. Well, it's worth noting that this really is new. Not very long ago, the long-term future of the firm was an important consideration for management, less and less so under modern forms of state capitalism. And rather interestingly, these issues were foreseen by the great founders of modern economics. Adam Smith, for example, he recognized and discussed what would happen to Britain if the masters adhered to the rules of sound economics, what's now called neoliberalism. He warned that if British manufacturers, merchants, and investors turned abroad, they might profit, but England would suffer. However, he felt that it wouldn't happen because these people the masters would be guided by a home bias. So as if by an invisible hand, England would be spared the ravages of economic rationality. Now that passage is pretty hard to miss. It's the only occurrence of the famous phrase, invisible hand, in Wealth of Nations, namely in a critique of what we call neoliberalism. The other leading founder of modern economics, David Ricardo, he drew similar conclusions. He hoped that home bias would lead, I'm quoting him now, would lead men of property to be satisfied with the low rate of profits in their own country rather than seek a more advantageous employment for their wealth in foreign nations. And he said these are feelings that I would be sorry to see weakened. Well, their predictions aside, the instincts of the classical economists were quite sound. Well, I mentioned before one well-known market inefficiency, effect of the market inefficiency of dismissing externalities, that is, the effect of a transaction on others. In the case of financial institutions, the externality that's dismissed is systemic risk, the risk that the whole system will crash as a result of some failed transaction. You don't take that into account when you make a transaction. Well, in that case, the taxpayer can come to the rescue, and it makes sure, then that way you can make sure that those who profit from risky transactions will be saved. But that's not always an option, and the consequences can be severe. In fact, perhaps awesomely severe. So nobody's going to come to the rescue if the environment is destroyed. And that it must be destroyed is close to an institutional imperative under contemporary state capitalism. Just think it through. Business leaders right now are conducting massive propaganda campaigns to convince the population that anthropogenic global warming, global warming because of human interference, is a liberal hoax. And they're succeeding. Like in the United States, probably 2/3 of the population believes this by now. Well, the CEOs who are running these campaigns, they understand what all of us understand. They understand that the threat is very real, very grave, that it'll destroy everything they own, it'll wreck the lives of their grandchildren. They know all of that. But they don't, as CEOs of a corporation, in that institutional role, they have no choice. They can pull out, of course. But if they stay there, they have to maximize short-term gain and market share. Actually, that's a legal requirement under Anglo-American law. If they don't do it, they'll be out and somebody else will come in who does do it. So it's an institutional property, not an individual one. And it does set off a vicious cycle, one that could be lethal. And to see how imminent the danger is, just have a look at the new Congress in the United States, the one that was propelled into power by large-scale business funding and propaganda. Almost everyone there is a climate change denier. And they've already been acting on those assumptions. They've been cutting the limited expenditures there are for dealing with environmental problems. And if the United States doesn't do anything significant, the rest of the world isn't either. Well, worse than that, some of them are true believers. So, for example, the new head of one of these committees on the environment, he explained that global warming can't be a problem because God promised Noah that there wouldn't be another flood. Takes care of that. Well, if that was happening, like in Andorra or some small remote country, maybe we would laugh. But it's not laughable when it's happening in the richest and most powerful country in the world. And before we laugh, we might bear in mind that the current economic crisis is traceable in no small measure to the fanatic faith in such dogmas as the efficient market hypothesis, and in general to what Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz 15 years ago called the religion that markets know best. The religion made it unnecessary for economists and the Federal Reserve to notice that there was an $8 trillion housing bubble that had no basis at all in economic fundamentals. It was way off historical trends, and that devastated the economy when it burst. No need to look at it because we have the religion. Markets know best, so forget it. Well, all of this and that religion is resuscitated despite what happened. All of this and much more can proceed as long as the general population is passive, apathetic, devoted to consumerism, or maybe hatred of the vulnerable. As long as that's true, the powerful can do as they please, and those who survive will be left to contemplate the ruins. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, my name is Sabra Sevi, and I'll be the moderator for the Q&A session that's about to follow. So what we'll do is we'll take questions from the floor in the Great Hall and the 2 overflow rooms as well. If you have questions, we have 2 volunteers. I'd like for you to kind of line up to my left or my right, well, left and right, and the volunteers will have the microphones. They will give it to you. You have about half a minute to ask your questions. I ask that you keep your questions to half a minute because there's so many people and we'd like to get through as many people as we possibly can. So I'll recognize you and then you can ask your question and Professor Chomsky will respond to it. I'll repeat it. Okay. We'll start there.
Good afternoon, Professor. My name's Aisha Imtiaz, and my question is actually in regards to the ambiguity that's surrounding the Goldstone report, in specific the retraction that has recently been documented. Professor, my question is that, in essence, is the Goldstone report in itself a retraction? Because the premise of the original allegations that were made in terms of Israel's utilization of white phosphorus, as well as the deliberate destruction of civilian communities. That is something that's a systemic part of the Israel foreign policy. So I just want you to sort of refer back and to perhaps comment on the fact that is the Goldstone report really, in essence, a retraction in itself? Thank you.
Well, if you, actually I think, first of all, Goldstone did not retract the report. Read the statement. He, in fact, didn't mention anything that would practically mention nothing that was in the report. That was pointed out right away by Human Rights Watch and others. He said he had changed. If he knew now what he'd known then, he said he would have written it differently. And then he talked about what he knows now. What he knows now turned out to be that Israel's conducting investigations. In fact, as Human Rights Watch pointed out, the investigations are totally meaningless. Nothing has come out of any of the investigations. One soldier was charged with, I think, stealing a credit card or something. And that's the result so far of the investigations. Well, it's not unique to Israel. That's what happens when countries investigate themselves. That's why nobody pays any attention. So like if Iran conducted an investigation of Iranian policy, we wouldn't even laugh. But Goldstone, for whatever his reasons may be, decided that that was important. That's it. Other than that, the allegations are exactly as they were. I should say, you may not notice, if you look at what I've written about this, I've never mentioned the Goldstone report, except for a few critical phrases, pointing out that it was a gift to the United States and Israel. Remember, that was a joint attack. It's the U.S. and Israel. We're not supposed to say that, but it was a joint military attack, and Goldstone gave him a gift. He wrote the mandate so as to exclude the only crucial issue. Did they have a right to attack? That's the crucial issue when some act of violence takes place. Well, he wrote the mandate to exclude that, and he explained why. He said, yeah, he thinks they had a right to attack. Well, okay, after you concede that, you're left with footnotes. like what can we discover long after the event about the nature of the attack. That's always used in bellow. It's always going to be indefinite. You know, who knows if there was some guy with a gun hiding behind the door and so on and so forth. I mean, even with that limitation, it's pretty damning. But the crucial issue was out, and it's worth looking at that crucial issue because they certainly did not have a right to attack. If they had fired a single pistol, single shot, it would have been a crime. And the reason is very simple. The discussion, you know, by Goldstone and the press and so on, it points out that a country has a right of self-defense, which is perfectly true and totally irrelevant. The question was, does it have a right of self-defense by force? That's a totally different question. Sure, everyone has the right of self-defense. So Russia had the right of self-defense against Afghanistan, and there was Afghan terror in the Soviet Union. But did it have the right to invade? That's the question, and the same question here. And the answer to that question is very straightforward. You do not have a right to use force unless you've exhausted peaceful means. That's both in law and in common morality, you know, whether it's family or international affairs. Were there peaceful means? Yeah, there certainly were. For example, Israel could have agreed to renew the ceasefire, which it broke. There was a ceasefire in place. Israel broke it November 4th by invading Gaza. During the ceasefire, as Israel officially concedes, there wasn't a single Hamas rocket. Well, there were offers to renew the ceasefire. Israel considered them, decided to ignore them, choosing instead to invade. And again, that's the U.S. Israel. That's a crime. That's the major crime. That's the reason why, at least personally, I never even cited the Goldstone report, except as in this the way I mentioned. There's plenty of serious allegations in it, but they're missing the main point. It's like, say, discussing Russian crimes in Afghanistan while not asking, did they have a right to invade? Well, you know, once you give that away, it's kind of footnotes.
Okay, so we'll take another question on that side, and then we'll move over.
I'm Mohammed Tavakkoli, and I thank you for your penetrating study of state corporate complex. I'm wondering whether this can be extended to the emerging and consolidating university and corporate complex, and what happens to the nature of public education and also research and what we teach and learn.
Yeah, a very live issue right here, in fact, with the Monk proposal for the Global Affairs Institute. Yeah, it's a serious problem, but we have to remember that when you talk about funding for the university, it's always coming from the outside. The universities do not produce commodities for sale. Okay, they're not profit-making institutions, at least they shouldn't be. They're supposed to meet other goals, the ones that Linda quoted from the very eloquent statement of University of Toronto. Well, since it's a parasitic institution by its nature, it's going to get funding or it won't survive. Well, in a decent society, it would just be a public obligation to ensure the healthy survival of institutions that meet those fine ideals. Well, we're not a healthy society, so that doesn't happen, and therefore you have to look for other sources of funding. For a long time, go back not too far, say when I was a student, you know, not ancient history for me at least, public education was free. So, I mean, I happened to go to a private college, but it costs almost nothing. I could $100 actually could get a scholarship, and the public institutions were publicly funded. Now, since the 1970s, that's changed radically. By now, in the United States, in most states, more than half of the funding for the public universities is coming from tuition. Okay. Now, what that does is impose a huge debt burden on students, and that has a function. It traps them. It's a mode of indoctrination and control. If you come out of college with $100,000 in debt, you're controlled. Maybe you wanted to become a public interest lawyer, but you're going to have no choice but to go to a corporate law firm. And once you go to a corporate law firm, you get absorbed in the culture, and it's off and running. And the same is true in everything else. So there is a technique of indoctrination and control that's been developed since the 70s, in part, I think in large part, in reaction to the activism of the 60s, which was too democratic, too free, terrified elites. And there are all sorts of techniques of control that are being restored, and this is one of them. Well, that's undermining public education, funding coming from tuition. It's not the way it's supposed to work. Also, it restricts it pretty much to the wealthy who can pay it. What about corporate funding? Well, corporate funding, like, say, the Munk Foundation, has its problems, serious problems. Is it going to affect academic programs and research and so on? If it is, I think it should be resisted. And there are plenty of ways to resist it. In fact, some of them Linda mentioned. In the case of, say, the Munk gift, it's coming from gold mining. Mining altogether is a total international scandal. Most of it's coming from Canada, and it has horrifying effects all over the world, destroying communities, destroying the environment. And gold mining is the worst, apart from which Barrick Gold has its own very credible human rights, charge of human rights violations. Well, that's a proper topic, I think Linda mentioned this, for a Institute of Global Affairs in a Canadian university, particularly one funded by the criminals. A proper topic is what are they doing, And that's not just academic. The people who are being harmed by these practices have no voice. But people here have a voice and can help protect them. And people do. There are solidarity groups. My daughter, for example, works in one that work on these issues. I've been involved too. Well, a university program is a perfect place for that. And this would be a fine place to do it. It's not outlandish. I talked about this a little bit yesterday, but just in my own institution. I happened to be for a long time, was a Pentagon-funded university, almost totally funded by the Pentagon. It was also the center of anti-war resistance. I don't mean protest, I mean resistance, real resistance. So a number of us were facing prison terms and so on. Well, that was taking place under 100% Pentagon funding. It can be done, and a lot of latitude. But the fact that there's going to be external funding is essentially inescapable. If the society does not recognize it as just an obligation to sustain free and independent institutions, well, it's just going to have to come from somewhere else.
All right, so we'll take 2 questions to my left, and then we'll look into the overflow rooms.
Mr. Chomsky, first of all, it's my pleasure to see you in person. As you know, some South American countries like Bolivia, Venezuela, and Ecuador are moving towards a more democratic and just society, and that alone creates enemies. Powerful corporations and countries related to them try to discredit them. In turn, they try to have alliances with different countries and progressive people in the world. What concerns me is that when these South American countries get close to countries with history of human rights abuse and brutal dictatorship, wouldn't that partly negate their purpose of creating support, especially amongst the people under repression and also progressive people in the world?
Yeah, I understood most, but not the last part. Did you
understand? Could you repeat the last part?
What I mean is that when they get close to countries.
When who gets close?
The South American countries,
yeah.
like Venezuela,
yeah,
Bolivia. when they get close to countries that have history of human rights abuse
Yeah.
and also brutal dictatorship.
What do you mean get close to?
Politically, economically, politically.
So like if Venezuela gets close to Iran, for
Exactly.
example? Yeah. Then,
Okay. So wouldn't that negate the fact that the people that are in those countries under repression, they wouldn't be able to support the countries that
so people in Iran would not
Exactly.
support Chavez, let's say.
Exactly.
Yeah, I suppose so. But what am I supposed to do about that?
I meant what is your opinion in regards to this kind of a,
Should
problem?
let's take, say, Brazil. Chavez is everybody's whipping boy, so let's put that aside. If he says 2 words, you have to attack it. So let's take Brazil, the most admired country in the South, the most popular political leader, in the modern world, Lula. Lula was very supportive of Iran. Okay, the United States was furious. In fact, Brazil and Turkey, the major regional power, infuriated the United States by working out a deal with Iran to handle the problem of the production of fissile materials. It was kind of interesting that Obama had favored that. In fact, the United States immediately denounced it, but as soon as they did, the Brazilian Foreign Ministry released a letter from Obama to the president urging him to proceed with this. The reason surely was that Obama assumed it would fail and then it could be a weapon to beat the Iranians over the head with. When it succeeded, they were furious and they immediately rammed through an almost meaningless UN resolution to try to undercut it. But it's true that Brazil was supportive of Iran in this respect. It tried to, along with Turkey, major regional power, it tried to find a way to get out of this crisis. Both Iran and Brazil and Turkey, incidentally, are increasing economic relations with Iran. So Turkey, for example, has announced at around the same time that it's tripling trade. They opened a pipeline to Iran. Now they're trying to integrate Iran into some sort of a regional system. Well, okay, I mean, we can decide whether we like that or not, but I don't see the problem with it. I'm in favor of it. I think they ought to be doing that. So I'm not sure I understand what the problem is.
What about the Iranian people?
Should the Iranian people support the fact that Turkey and Brazil are trying to find a resolution for the nuclear issue and increasing trade? I suspect they probably do support that. Remember that you're Iranian? Yeah, so you know better than I do that in Iran, there's overwhelming support for the nuclear energy program. Almost everybody supports it. So if somebody's finding a way to get around the conflict, I imagine they'd think that's fine. They don't want to be bombed. As for increasing trade, well, you have to ask them, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's a popular move. On the other hand, if it's supporting the repression, that's a different story. But I don't think Brazil or Turkey is doing that. Actually, we might ask ourselves while we're on this, what's the issue about Iran? Okay, it's a big issue. I mean, that is the issue, the leading issue in U.S. foreign policy. The leading issue is the Iranian threat. This is called the year of Iran. We got to deal with the Iranian threat. Everybody's hysterical about it. One thing you don't see discussed is what is the Iranian threat? Okay, try to find a discussion of that. Actually, we have an authoritative answer to that question. It's just not reported. The authoritative answer comes from the Pentagon and from U.S. intelligence. Can't get higher than that. Every year, the Pentagon and the intelligence system provide an analysis to Congress of the global security situation. And the last one, of course, spent a lot of time on Iran. And here's what it said. Don't take my word for it. Look it up. You can find it on the internet. What they said is there's no military threat. They said Iran has very low military expenditures, even by the standards of the region. Its military strategy is defensive. It's to try to protect the country against an invasion and delay an invasion long enough so that diplomacy can set in. They said they have almost no capacity to deploy force. In fact, General Petraeus, head of the Central Command, not long ago, said something like, he said that the Qatari Air Force could take out the Iranian Air Force in 15 minutes or something. But so they're not, and they said if they're developing nuclear weapons, which they don't know, it would be part of their deterrent strategy. And if any country needs a deterrent strategy, it's Iran. It's completely surrounded by hostile military forces of a aggressive, brutal superpower, totally surrounded. Countries next to it are occupied, and the United States and its allies are constantly threatening an attack, which happens to be in violation of the UN Charter, if anybody cares, and in violation of specific Security Council resolutions, which ask countries not to do that. They're polite enough not to mention the countries that are doing it. So yeah, they need a deterrent. In fact, one of Israel's leading military historians, Martin von Crefeld, he doesn't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, but after the invasion of Iraq, he wrote that if Iran we've just seen that the US and Britain attacked Iraq for no reason at all, and if Iran is not developing nuclear weapons, they're crazy. That was just straight description. Well, I don't want them to have nuclear weapons, even though most of the Arab world does. But it's not, whatever it is, it's not a military threat. And then, in fact, the intelligence of the Pentagon go on to describe the actual threat. And it's interesting reading. It tells us a lot about ourselves. The threat is that Iran is trying to extend its influence into neighboring countries. So it's trying to extend its influence into Iraq and Afghanistan. There's a word for that. It's called destabilization. They're trying to destabilize the neighboring countries. When we invade and occupy and destroy those countries, that's called stabilization. I'm not joking. I'm not joking. And they're trying to destabilize them by expanding their influence. Well, obviously that's totally illegitimate. We can't accept that. That's the threat. The Iranian government is a threat. It's a terrible threat to its own population. I'm afraid it's not unique in that respect. Same is true of a number of our closest allies. But that's a threat, all right. However, what's called the Iranian threat is not that. And people ought to understand it. This is the major issue in foreign policy now. So at least understand what it is.
I'll take this back.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. I was actually going to ask about the Goldstone report, but that got tackled right off the bat. So forgive me if this question is a little improvised. But right after 9/11, you and Christopher Hitchens had a sort of dispute in the Nation. And, he sort of accused you of being an apologist for Islamic fundamentalism. And you accused him of using these horrible acts to justify U.S. foreign policy. But my focus is more his Hitchens' staunch secularism and those of other so-called new atheists like Sam Harris, who seem to have the staunch secularism, which I personally agree with, but use it to justify an aggressive foreign policy. So I'm just thinking of how to word this as a question. Do you see a way to not reconcile? Do you see a way to separate the staunch secularism of Harris and Hitchens from their warmongering and, in Harris's case, outright support for torture?
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe I can take that. Yeah. If I understood you, it's actually... No? No? Huh? What?
What's going on?
This is okay? Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, there are two questions, if I understood it. One is about the claim that I was justifying 9/11. Oh, no. Well, why did you bring up Hitchens? Well, because he's one of those atheists. What? He's an atheist. Well, can I skip the first part of the question because it's just a total fabrication, and there's no point wasting time on it. But the second part, what about the secularism? Well, first of all, I think that they are religious fanatics. They happen to believe in the state religion, which is much more dangerous than other religions for the most part. So they, both of them, happen to be defenders of the state religion, namely the religion that says we have to support the violence and atrocities of our own state because it's being done for all sorts of wonderful reasons, which is exactly what everyone says in every state. And I don't regard, that's just another religion, like the religion that markets know best. I mean, it doesn't happen to be a religion that you pray to every once a week, but it's just another religion, and it's very destructive.
Okay, so I'd like to see if there's any questions in the East Common Room first. Are there any questions in the East Common Room?
Yeah, one moment.
So we have enough time to take one question for each overflow room.
You just talk.
Okay. My question is a little bit separate from the topics of today. It relates to your work on linguistics. So originally, when you attacked Skinner's behaviorist model of language acquisition, you did it on the basis that the poverty of stimulus required that we had some prior faculty in our mind that allowed us to learn language from limited examples. Do you think there's a similar argument or account of a common human morality can be given? And do you have such an account, or do you have an idea of what such an account would look like?
Just to respond, if you look at that, as far as the review of Skinner was concerned, almost 95% of it was just running through claims that he was making and arguing that these are totally absurd based on nothing. I mean, I did at the very end of the review say, look, there's another way of looking at this, which comes out of mainstream biology. Mainstream biology just takes for granted that every capacity, you know, your visual system, your ability to walk, whatever it may be, is based on some genetic property. I mean, that's not even discussed. And that's, in linguistics, it happens to be called poverty of stimulus, but it's universal. What it means is that the kind of creature you are is not determined by the inputs. Like, you can't change a human embryo into a cat embryo by changing around the nutrition in the uterus. You know, it's going to become a human being. You know, that's because it's built that way. That's just a biological truism, and it's presumably no reason to doubt that it's also true of language. I think it is. What about morality? Well, I think it's the same thing. Actually, that was pointed out by David Hume. He is, you know, the leading empiricist, but there's a lot of confusion about what empiricism is. The empiricists, like Locke and Hume and others, contrary to illusions, they believed in innate structure. And the reason is they were not idiots. I mean, of course, everything that happens comes out of innate, in a large part out of innate structure. Well, what about morality? Hume couldn't give much of a proof, but he said, he just made some observations, which are correct. He said, look, we're constantly making moral decisions in new situations, and they're pretty consistent, and other people pretty much comprehend them, and so on. Well, if we're doing that, it must be that we have some principles that are lying behind it. And the principles can't be picked up by induction. In fact, in his view, nothing can. It's all what he called animal instinct. It's coming from animal instinct. That's what's now called genetic endowment. So genetic endowment is determining our capacity to gain knowledge, understanding, develop moral principles, and so on and so forth. And I think that's I don't see how that can be false. Well, the next problem is to try to go on and find out what they are. Well, there's plenty of work on that. That's in fact a large part of the content of classical moral philosophy. And it's picked up again in modern work. For example, John Rawls's famous theory of justice, probably the most influential work in political science, political philosophy in the last century. That's what he does. In fact, he picks a linguistic model, if you look. He says our concept of justice, that part of morality, has to be just like our acquisition of language. And then he discusses parallels. And then he tries to show what the principles would be, kind of original condition type thing, what they would be. All right, you can say you got it right or you got it wrong, but that's the program. And I don't see what other program there could be. There is more contemporary work, recent work, proceeding further with this. There's even empirical studies by now of children's moral judgment, comparative moral judgments in different societies, and some theoretical structure about what might lie behind them. Well, yeah, that's empirical inquiry into the nature of, into what our moral nature is. But that it must be there, I think, is pretty obvious, even from Hume's comments.
Okay, great. So we'll take one question from the debates room.
1 second, please. Yeah.
Hello, Mr. Chomsky. I'd just like to thank you, first of all, for coming and for answering more questions than Stephen Harper seems to be answering on his election cycle. I'd just like to ask, you've discussed a lot, the title of your talk today was the state-corporate complex. You've made your views pretty clear in the long term that you think that a libertarian socialist solution is a practical one for society. You've called it a natural extension of classical liberalism. In the short term, what do you see involving the usefulness of programs like campaign finance reform and things of that nature, simply for the short term?
In the short term, what is the use of things like finance reform, for example?
That's right.
Yeah. Well, in the short term, it was not a very far-reaching proposal that we should go back to something that's worked very well in the past. Finance regulation, say, of the New Deal type, was very successful. There were no financial crises. The financial crises are pretty devastating. Plenty of people suffer from them, and they're going to get worse. So yes, regulatory reform, the kind that, for example, Volcker was advocating. That's why he was thrown out, and others. Sure, they make perfectly good sense. I mean, there is a bill that came out of the Senate, the Dodd-Frank bill, which, if it were implemented, it would probably have some dampening effect on crises. It's getting chipped away at by lobbyists, so what's going to be left is probably nothing. But sure, it would make perfectly good sense, just like the reasonable health reform would make good sense. For example, in the United States, again, it's not a particularly dramatic proposal, but if the United States had a healthcare system like every other industrial society, there wouldn't be any deficit. In fact, there'd be a surplus. Well, that's important because the deficit is being used to cut away at extremely useful programs. Furthermore, the fact that there are 50 million people uninsured and that healthcare is pretty much rationed by wealth, that has all kind of horrible consequences. So sure, nothing wrong with reforms. There's a lot of simple reforms that could be made. I mean, I think we can go way beyond them, but just very simple, straightforward reforms could make a much better world. I don't know if I got the question correctly, but yeah.
Okay, so we are going over time, so we're pretty much towards the end. We have time for one more question, so we'll take it from, go ahead.
Yeah, is that good? Mic check. Dr. Chomsky, it was always a little odd to me that you don't identify as a semiotician, and I was just wondering maybe if you could talk about the field of semiotics, what you see, if there's a future for that in academia, maybe what your experience is.
You better come.
He wants you to talk about the field of semiotics.
Semiotics? Yeah. It's one of those, remember when Goering was supposedly asked what he thought about culture, he said he reaches for his revolver. But it's not quite that bad. But I don't know what it is. I mean, it's the general theory of everything symbolic and use of signs. I think that's too broad to be a real field. But there are particular aspects of it that are interesting, like linguistics, or like animal communication, or like the visual arts and so on. Whether there's anything unifying to say about those, well, if there is, fine, be in favor of it. But a lot of the work that's being done, at least in my judgment, looks pretty shallow, and but draw your own conclusions. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to see you again,
yeah.
and thank you for what you brought us this afternoon. I had the pleasure of presenting Noam Chomsky at a Hart House meeting against the Vietnam War in 1966. It's really nice to see him still rolling along, eh? Hart House has contributed a huge amount to the possibility of this meeting. Many of the volunteers and the central organization, and I want to point out another aspect of history, that Hart House is represented here by Louise Cowan, the warden, by Linda McQuaig. Did you know that she was an undergraduate debater in the Hart House Debates Committee? And by Semra Sevi, who pulled all of this together, who did a lot of the chairing here this afternoon, all of whom would have been forbidden prior to 1970, because under the bequest, it was an all-male institution. And I think we didn't plan it this way, but it's a happy coincidence that three women are the face of Hart House this afternoon. And I also want to thank all the others who helped us out. Bev Stoll in Massachusetts, planning Noam's trip, and our many volunteers, and the two organizations, Science for Peace, of which I'm a representative, and Near East Cultural and Educational Foundation, of which I'm also a member. And our material is outside. I urge you to take a look at it, not only because we were good hosts, which I hope we were, but because, as Professor Chomsky reminds us, of the challenges and opportunities of the present, which our masters in corporations and government refuse to face or to tell the truth about. We must take their place. We must find the truth and act on it. And I invite you all to come forward with us in this.